Welcome back into the live desk. Right now, we are following a topic that is being widely debated right now, and that is aging politicians. So with that being said, I do want to take a look at this video right here. Senator Mitch McConnell, the top Republican in the Senate, he actually froze and appeared confused during a news conference this week. After recovering off camera, the 81-year-old returned to take questions, telling reporters that he was doing just fine. And then there was this also happening this week.
I note the presence of a quorum. We will now vote to report the Defense Appropriations Bill favorably, subject to amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Feinstein.
Say aye.
Pardon me?
Aye.
Yeah.
Just say
I would like to support a yes vote on this. It provides $823 billion. That's an increase of $26 billion for the Department of Defense. And it funds priorities submitted.
yeah, just say aye.
Okay, just
Great,
aye.
Okay, so that was Senator Dianne Feinstein. She is 90 years old. She began to give a speech, as you just heard there, and she was only asked to make a procedural vote. So with all of that being said, I do want to turn things over to Deborah Leiter. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at UMKC. Deborah, I want to thank you so much for joining me here at the live desk. How's it going?
Going really well. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, of course. And, you know, with all of those videos that I just showed, I do want to ask you, do you think that it is fair for Americans to question whether advanced politicians, older politicians, have a right to still be in office right now?
I think it's a very fair question. Americans constantly look to the composition of the Senate and the House and ask about the quality of governance. There's kind of two key pieces here. There's a question of representation and there's a question of capacity. And I think both are really important here when we're thinking about the age and the ability of our legislators to serve.
And you know, I do want our viewers who are joining us now to leave their comments down below, but I also want to touch on this. McConnell, you know, he has led the Senate, the GOP, for the past 16 years, and he is the longest serving Senate party leader ever. So the experience is there, and he also mentioned today that he plans to serve the rest of his current term. Do you think that it is fair for people to bring up his health concerns, because we know that that has also been an ongoing topic here lately?
This is a really important point, is that the US Senate doesn't actually have any policies in place for when legislators become incapacitated. In fact, back in the 1960s, one senator had a stroke and refused to resign, and that seat essentially stayed vacant for 3 years. So there is a really important question about whether voters are being represented if their legislators are unable to attend and perform. So I think that this question of capacity is a really important one.
Yeah, and so they're still staying on top of their jobs, seems like, except for these hiccups that, you know, happen, and it happened this week a few times with these two senators. But also, you know, President Joe Biden, he's had some falls here recently, and he's had some hiccups as well. He is 80 years old, the oldest elected president, and we are starting to see, obviously, more older politicians. Do you happen to know maybe why that is?
There's a number of interesting issues. It's actually kind of interesting. Right now, the House of Representatives has gotten a little bit younger, average age of about 58, and the Senate has gotten older, an average age of 65, keeping in mind that the average age of Americans, or I should say the median age of Americans, is about 35. Part of the reason is that people are staying in office for a long period of time. They're elected at a somewhat older age and then staying in office. So part of it is that incumbency effect. Once you get elected to the Senate, people stay in for some time. It's also increasingly hard to get elected to the Senate, and having resources, connections, and experience are increasingly important. So a combination of both people being elected at an older age and also staying in for longer and living longer are some of the reasons we're seeing senators becoming older.
Right, and you know, there are both sides of the argument. I've been kind of watching this all day as I follow this topic, and there are people who are saying that there are also qualified younger Americans who can apply for these positions as well that they're holding on to.
That's always a big point, is that when you have people staying in office for a long period of time, we tend to see less different kinds of people able to get in. And the part, of course, anyone can run against these older senators who are incumbents, but it's really hard to get people to vote against them. So that's where that important trade-off comes in, is that these older senators are reelected for reasons. They're experienced, they're qualified, they're well-connected. Your term in the Senate determines how much influence you have there. At the same point, it's also keeping new voices, younger voices from being able to enter.
Right, and so, we are entering election season, and when I speak of election, I do want to talk about nationally because we do have the presidential election coming up in 2024. So when it comes down to it, do you think that voters are really considering age, or do you think that they are truly just considering experience? And like we mentioned, a lot of the older politicians right now, they do have more experience because they've been holding on to those seats for a very long time.
I think there's a certain point to which age starts to come into the conversation. And in other political offices, there are age caps. For example, in the state of Missouri, judges have to retire by the age of 70. So in many political positions, people do have sort of a maximum age where it stops being about experience and starts being about age. And certainly the upcoming 2024 election will likely have the two oldest candidates ever facing off against each other. And one of the challenges is, because people are living for so long today, and health is so varied, one person's 80 is another person's 40 and vice versa. So I do think that this is something that people are starting to consider, that advanced age really can matter. We certainly saw, for example, Ronald Reagan, previously one of our oldest presidents, was very different in term one versus term two, and part of that had to do with age. So I do think people are paying attention to it, but it's very likely in 2024 that the choice is going to be between two candidates who are about the same age. And I know I've heard, at least from my students, some frustration with that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because you are an associate professor with UMKC, is this a conversation that you guys often talk about?
It is a really frequent conversation. In fact, a lot of times people talk about composition of the U.S. Senate, what it looks like. And most people don't know is that age is actually one of the worst parts of representativeness of the U.S. Congress, that it looks much less like the rest of the country on age. And students often point out that they don't feel like they have someone they can vote for because there's no one like them discussing their issues. For example, the issues of student loans. My students, I bet, have a very different perspective on this than someone who is, say, 83, like Dianne Feinstein.
Right, and yeah, that's another good point. Is you bring up student loans. Do your students maybe have you heard from students, I should say, that maybe want someone younger to represent them?
We know both from seeing my students and from research, people like to vote for people who are like them, that share some of their experiences, and certainly very few voters will get a chance when they're young to vote for someone around their same age. So that is certainly something people point to. And we also know, and it's probably worth noting, that the average age of voters is much older than the average age of citizens. So voters actually might be considering age a lot more than we think, but turnout rates for people in their 70s or 80s tend to be 4 to 5 times higher than folks in their 20s. So we might actually just be seeing voters voting on age in ways we hadn't thought of before.
All righty, well, there you have it. I think this is a very timely and also a very popular conversation right now. Is those two senators, they are really in the national spotlight right now due to their hiccups that they had. So I do want to thank you so much, Deborah, for joining me here at the Live Desk. Is there anything else that you want to touch on that maybe I have not asked you?
But, I think just the one thing to keep in mind is part of the challenge here is the Senate doesn't have any policies that allow people to take short-term leave. For example, choosing a different issue, Tammy Duckworth, when she was on maternity leave, had to still come to the Senate and vote. So one answer to this question, of course, is considering electing younger citizens or younger legislators. Another answer is the Senate can always change its rules to allow for short-term leave. And I think as we start to see more and more older legislators sitting, they may really have to consider not just who's elected, but how those folks serve.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Deborah. Again, she is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at UMKC, and she has a lot of knowledge there. So thank you again for joining me here at the Live Desk. Again, I am Janae Hancock here at the Live Desk. I am going to leave you all with this live shot overlooking Kansas City as we go into the weekend.